Hello and welcome to the Motogp Xtra podcast. Joining me today as always is Rhys, also known as Biker Gaming. So for round 5 we jet off to Portugal. Now Rhys, Friday was an absolute washout for all three classes. What did you make of pretty much the first 2 days of on-track action with all that rain?
It was really crazy, to be honest, just because how much rain there was. You think, oh, we're going back to Europe, it'll be all nice and normal, but no, it absolutely wasn't. There was so many crashes in every session. I don't even know who crashed and who didn't, to be honest. There was that many and in what class and stuff like that. But there was just people down all the time. Different people topping the timesheets, obviously, I suppose, with the wet. It is a bit of an equaliser. And again, being back in Europe, I suppose everybody knows the track. So it definitely balanced things out a little bit. I think Oliveira was top of one of the free practice sessions. I think Marquez was as well. So yeah, it was pretty crazy, all the wet conditions.
So yeah, we're going to jump straight into Moto 3. We're going to go straight into the quali. We're not going to mess around at all. So Anshu taking pole position, and we have to first jump to the two Vision Track riders, Scott Ogden and Josh Watley. Brilliant weekend from them up till Saturday. What did you make of a real surprise weekend for the two Brits?
It's really nice to see. Obviously, being a Brit myself, it's always good to see. They seem to have made a big step this weekend, the whole team, because both Scott and Josh are both much quicker. I mean, to be fair, Scott had already got through to Q2 in previous races, but it was more convincingly through to Q2. Obviously, Josh managing to go through Q1 and getting into Q2, so that was really nice to see. Obviously, sadly, Josh then did crash in Q2, but even still, big confidence boost. I think one of those things probably just being back in Europe, a track that I'm not 100% sure whether they know based on what junior categories they've been in, because I'm not really 100% sure of the different calendars or the different ones, but I'd imagine they've been there at some point. I think they've probably tested there potentially.
They were there for 2 days of testing before the season.
Yeah, so they've been to the track before, they know the track, and being back in Europe as well, a bit more familiar, no jet lag, which is also good for us because we actually get to watch it at a decent time. So yeah, it's always nice to have a bit more of that comfort, and I think they've both been home as well between the last race and this race, which, you know, with them being so young, is really helpful for them. So it was good to see the Vision Track guys being a bit better this weekend, and a good race as well from Scott. I'm not really sure where Josh finished in the end. I think he slipped back a little bit in the race, but even still, they can definitely take that in their stride and hopefully build the confidence based on that weekend.
Yeah, so Scott was battling in the top 10. He did end up finishing about P13, I believe, and Watley was outside of the top 20. Again, battling with some of the more senior riders, so again, a lot of confidence and experience mainly built for the two lads. And again, mentioning that they went home, if you forget these lads are so young, it'll be great for them to go home just to get settled, rested, kind of absorb some of the few weeks of being away and all the information that's been thrown at them. So no surprise that when they finally got to a track that they knew that they could kind of bring it together a bit better, and it really shows what a brilliant job Vision Track are doing to be already fighting for pole position as Scott was in Q2. But we're going to have to quickly mention Sergio Garcia crashing 3 times in Q2 and still getting on the second row. Just a quick shout out there for probably one of the craziest qualifying sessions from the Spaniard.
Yeah, it was a little bit strange, wasn't it? And I think again it kind of brings into the question sometimes some of these rules, because obviously so many of the laps got ruined by the yellow flags, and I think the rule as it is, I understand what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to be, if you see a yellow flag, your lap's cancelled, so you may as well roll off. But it doesn't seem to work that way, because sometimes they get away with it, sometimes their lap sticks. It all depends on how long it's been since the yellow flag first came out. So basically, you're just encouraging riders to keep going pinned through a yellow flag zone. A better rule would probably be, if you don't slow down when you see a yellow flag, you actually get a penalty rather than just potentially losing your lap. I think that probably would be a bit safer, but at the minute, the yellow flag rule seems to just kind of encourage them to just go flat out through the corner, which is obviously no good. And with Garcia as well, I don't think he did it on purpose, because you can't really do that on purpose to crash 3 times, but again, it does kind of show that if someone wanted to, they could set a good time and just run off into the gravel, pretend they've got a bike problem or crash and spend way too long in the gravel, and it could stop other people improving.
Yeah, really, there is no easy fix for the yellow flag rule. Either way, if you say if you don't slow down, riders complain that, well, I was on a qualifying lap, I'm using 100% of my focus, I didn't see it, which is a valid point. If you look back at Pecco Bagnaia last year at Portimao, coming down into Craig Jones' corner, went through yellow flag, complete other side of the track, he wouldn't have physically been able to see it. And again, so it's probably the best of a bad bunch at the moment, but hopefully going forward the organisers can maybe get some sort of a better rule, just because it's ruining sessions. It ruined pretty much every qualifying session this weekend. But we're going to move on now to the race. Sergio Garcia did get away early, but was caught back up by the group behind him. So in that group was the 2 Aspar riders, the 2 IOs, and then who's the other man that I am forgetting? Sasaki, the Japanese rider. So the Max Racing Husqvarna again showing good form. But what did you make of the early stage of a Moto3 race, considering it was their first time on a dry track and literally no setup time or anything? So it was a real question mark of how that race would go.
Yeah, it was going to be really weird. I think, to be honest, for all the races, they didn't really have any dry track time before particularly, so it was going to be a bit of a lottery. But off the start, Onchu and Garcia both got away really well. And then I think it also helped the fact that Adji was in third. Like, he's obviously a fantastic rider in the rain, because we saw back in Mandalika how good he was. But obviously he hasn't quite got that same pace in the dry, so I think he sort of held the group up a little bit as well, which helped them out, because Onchu and Garcia managed to pull a fairly decent gap on that first lap. And then even after that, Garcia then left Onchu, and Onchu got caught up. But in the end, of course, they did all close back up. But that does sometimes happen, and I think, to be honest, Portimao as a track seems to allow that quite a lot, even though you wouldn't think so, because they're full throttle for so much through some of these high-speed corners. You can get a draft through those corners. But I think because it's such a technical circuit, it actually extends the gaps between the riders again. It kind of brings a bit more skill back into it, because it is quite often said that the Moto3 bikes are just too easy to ride, and because they have such little power, the slipstream matters more than the actual rider's skill. So you can actually have a big train of riders where the fastest guy on the track probably, could be a few tenths of on that, a few tenths quicker than one of the slower guys, but because of the slipstream, he can overtake him. So it does sometimes allow these big groups to form, and I think Portimao, just the way it is, allows them to sort of pull away a bit more.
Yeah, and again, with a race with so little practice, gaps did start to form, unlike you'd usually see in a normal Moto3 race. Now, it could be track, it could be the lack of practice, but obviously, as we said, Garcia pulled away, then there was a gap of 4, so it was a bit like a Moto2 race in some parts, where there was groups of riders, small gaps developing, but it did all the way to the end. After Garcia got caught, was a lovely battle of 5 riders, and thankfully they all managed to get across the line cleanly. What did you make of the last couple of laps, and how the last few laps really spiced up the racing?
It was some good battling, good clean battling as well, which is always a nice change for Moto3, especially when Dennis Onchu's involved. I will give him props there. He seemed a lot cleaner this weekend. He was still aggressive and ragged, but more than fair. So I don't know whether someone sat him down and maybe said something to him, or maybe he was just lucky he didn't pull anything too aggressive and didn't collide with anybody. So that was nice to see. And there's some really intelligent riding going on as well, especially from Garcia. Sort of as he started that final lap, he dropped back just a bit from Sasaki, allowed him to get a really good draft onto the front straight and just pass him going into turn 1, which stopped him from then being overtaken by anybody. And then I think Masia did a very harsh move on Sasaki, which also helped him out, but he managed to take it into the first corner, do a perfect last lap, and managed to hold the lead to the line. So some good battling, along with some good strategy as well, which I always like to see in Moto3. And it's worth noting that actually Garcia, that's probably the second race so far, well, his second win obviously, but the second race so far that we've seen where he's actually had some very good strategy. I mean, in Argentina, a very similar thing. I mean, I don't think it was necessarily deliberate to drop behind the 2 Leopards in that race, but he kept it calm and collected and pulled a fantastic pass, obviously take the win from Foggia on that occasion. So Garcia is really, starting to become a bit of a really well-rounded rider, and definitely someone to watch for the future. And to be honest, he's going to push Foggia for this championship, I think.
Yeah, and Garcia has been known as a bit of a hothead, has a bit of a mistake, and can slightly blur the lines between fair and over the line sometimes. But this year, he does look like he has really got the balance down, And again, he got passed in the last corner on the penultimate lap in Argentina and managed to repass it the same corner. So he does have very good racecraft in the last few laps. I think there's been a bit of a change in the last few years in the Moto3 class. A lot of new riders coming to the front, so some with a bit of experience could really kind of, the cream comes to the top, you could say, in the championship. So he'd be a great man for the championship. But we're going to move on now to everyone's favourite for the championship, Dennis Foggia, and he had a pretty poor weekend overall. In the end, did score decent points, but with Garcia winning, did lose a good solid 10 points or so to his rival. What did you make of Foggia's Portuguese Grand Prix?
It was a little bit of one of those weekends that we've seen from Foggia throughout his career. It seemed like so far this season and the end of last season he'd kind of got over that, but we have seen throughout his career where some weekends he just isn't there. He's just nowhere all weekend, and it probably didn't help him that it's wet, because I don't think he's a great wet weather rider, but if you're going to be a world champion you have to be good in all conditions, because you can get these conditions. It can rain does exist, so it is one of those things where he definitely needs to try and work on that, because he was clearly struggling in the rain. But then even in the dry, actually in the race, he didn't come through as much as I expected he would have done. And I think that's partially down to him, but also partially down to something that I did note in the race, was the fact that the lead group were all KTMs. I think the top Honda rider was Mino in 7th place, I believe. I think that's where he finished.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think the KTM is taking a bit of a march. We've seen it at a few races in sort of the last season or so, that they've had really good straight line speed, and they've looked like a really good package to be on. And it seems like maybe at the minute the KTM is actually a bit of a better bike to be on, because you can call it a Husqvarna or whatever, but it's still a KTM, so they're all the same bike in that lead group. And I think then Moreira was also then behind them as well, and beating Mino. So probably for Foggia it's probably more difficult to maybe make the ground, even with that straight line speed advantage the Leopard tends to have, because Suzuki also didn't get too high up the order. They were obviously battling down with the other Hondas, like Scott Ogden, for example. Obviously we mentioned him earlier. So yeah, it was a bit of a poor weekend from Foggia, but maybe not all down to him. Perhaps there is a little bit of an advantage for the KTM riders now.
Yeah, it is probably a good way to look at it, where the other Hondas finished. And like you said, Mino scraping in the top 10 probably wasn't as bad, since he's probably the second Honda, Foggia. But moving on now, we're going to jump to the middle class Moto2. These were the third race of the day. We're going to start off with FP1, the young Dutch rider Zonta van der Gerber. We've covered a bit about him already on the podcast. FP1, he was stunning, absolutely horrendous conditions, and he was just going around faster and faster and faster. Finished the FP1 top and was about 1.6, 1.5 quicker than anyone else in the field. What did you make of the first session for Zonta in Portugal?
As this season goes on, Zonta just keeps impressing me more and more, to be honest with you. Obviously, it was a wet session, so that does, change things a little bit. But he went out there, he was confident, he was miles quicker than everybody else. I think he was out there for most of the session, just going around doing laps. And as a rookie, that's exactly what you should be doing. So it was a great session from him. Really good confidence boost as well to sort of top that time sheet. It's back to a track he knows. Obviously, he's raced out in the CV before, and obviously he tested a Moto2 bike for the first time. He tested the NTS at the end of last year at this circuit. So it's good for him, once again, obviously going back to Europe as well with that. But yeah, like I was saying, he's just been really, really impressing me, especially just considering how young he is. And obviously he'd never really ridden a bike of this capacity before testing. It was just unbelievable just how well he's doing.
Yeah, unfortunately at the start of FP2 went out, and he probably got a little ahead of himself, had a bit of a crash, and actually didn't feature for the rest of Friday. But moving on now, we're going to just kind of briefly cross over the qualifying. Not much happened. There was, again, yellow flags. Wasn't really a action packed. It was pretty dull qualifying, so we're going to skip on to the race. Canet was on pole, Bobier was second, and Dixon on the front row in third. So just before the race started for the Moto2 boys, there was spits of rain on the camera. Turn 3 looked quite blustery. There was dark clouds everywhere. There was a bit of a sense of dread in the air over all of the weather conditions we had the previous 2 days. Everyone was kind of getting fearful of what could happen in the rain. We don't have intermediate tyres in the MotoGP paddock at all through 3 classes. After today's race, there might be a question of why we don't. But what did you make of the opening few laps of the Moto2 race with all the soon-to-be controversy?
Yeah, it was an interesting start. Fairly typical Moto2 to some extent, because of course there was sort of a bit of rain early on, but they didn't seem to be too affected by it actually until obviously the incident that we'll talk about in a minute. They were sort of going around doing pretty decent lap times. I think they were only a little bit off the lap record, so it seemed like a pretty decent start. Canet had got away well. Cameron Beaubier was looking pretty quick, sat in behind him, and then obviously Iagora had come from a little bit further behind and closed up to them as well. So it looked like there was actually going to be a bit of a battle hotting up between those three before the sudden downpour in Sector 1, it seemed, where they all fell off. So yeah, the start was pretty good. Jake Dixon had dropped back a little bit as well, but then he was sort of fighting his way back through. But it was a fairly typical Moto2 start that you'd expect. A couple riders sort of pulling away from everybody else, and these gaps starting to form. But then the incident happened. I'll pass back over to you quickly for that. But
yeah, again, nearly every week we have to mention the stewards, and visibly on the camera lens, every time they went into turn 3, they went to the outside shot of the gravel side where they were looking back across the track, and you could see this circular kind of fog on the camera that had been lap on lap getting worse. There was a massive cloud over there, and unfortunately in the live coverage, the GP coverage of it, we were on board with Iagora just behind Cam Beaubier, and basically the front three high-sided in Symphony. Canet managed to regain control of the bike and kind of was nearly on his knees going into the gravel, probably at 100 miles an hour. It was very scary. Dixon was the only rider behind that managed to stay on. A few more further back, Joe Roberts out of note stayed on. I think 11 riders hit the deck. There was 2 bikes collided, then another bike hit another bike that went up in flames. Nightmare really. It was just horrific, because it reminded me of Le Mans them years ago. I think 2018 happened, where they had that crash in La Chapelle where they all just rode off the track with a bit of oil. It just, that whole sector 1, turn 2, 3, that complex there was just from one lap to the other had got completely soaked, and the outcome was horrific. I just was watching it going, I hope nobody gets collected by a bike. Iagora had to jump over a fellow rider that was tumbling through the gravel at fearful speeds. But what did you make of it? What do you think mainly of the steward's decision not to red flag it up to that point?
It's a tough one, really. I mean, like you say, it definitely was a very reminiscent of the Le Mans incident all those years ago in Moto3, where obviously on that occasion it was oil rather than rain, which again, you could argue they probably should have noticed that was on the track. This time, yeah, there was rain every single lap. It did look like it was getting worse. And I'm not really sure how to feel about this one. Like, it is very easy to say that the race direction should have brought out a red flag, but every other lap they were going through absolutely fine. It just, as soon as they got there on that occasion, obviously some more rain had gone down, and it was obviously a stream forming across the track, and it was having them off. Now, again, that's probably something they should have noticed, seen that, but sometimes these things do happen quite quickly, and to their credit, they did bring the red flag out very quickly, which is something that they've not done a lot of the time. We've seen recently there's been like crashes where riders have been unconscious in the track and stuff like that, where they've like let it go on way too long. So in that case, all right, they red flagged it quick enough, but perhaps they should have noticed the rain on the track. It is a tough one because it's not like it was fluid leaking from a bike or anything. They can't really control the rain. Like you were saying about the intermediate tyres as well, they obviously don't have those, so they can't run on them. I think the reason why they don't have them is just because this situation doesn't happen that often. It's kind of a waste to produce that tyre, all the expense and all the freight. They take those tyres to the race every weekend and they never get used. I think the Michelins did have intermediates for one season, I believe. Was it back in 2016? Did they
16,
have intermediates? Yeah. I don't think they ever used them. I think that's why they scrapped them. So
Ian only used them in one free practice session. That was the only time the whole season.
Only time they ever got used. Yeah, well, that's probably why they didn't. That's probably why they don't bother. I can understand it to some extent, but then you have to take that into account when you're thinking: is this a safe condition to run the race in? Is there too much rain? But again, none of the riders had their hands up or anything, so it is tough to call.
Yeah, it was a bit of a blind one because they were going at a pretty high pace, and you were kind of watching it, and from the camera into turn 7 there was a lot of rain on the camera, but the track seemed pretty good. There wasn't any. You usually see the rider knows before the track conditions gets worse. You see him set up to throw the hand up just a couple of seconds before he usually gets red flagged, but they were just barreling down into turn 1 and they just went full speed into 2, and they just so many high sides. And again, I think in these situations where before, it wasn't as if it happened lap 16 of 22 where they're like, oh, it just came out of nowhere. On the grid, it was spitting raining. They should have had, I think anyway, I don't know if I'm out of place saying this, but I think they should have people in at least every section, not every corner, because again, how you can't really control it that way, but they would have seen, when you're there, you can kind of understand what cloud is going to be a bit more dangerous than others. You could see from the camera that turn 2 was visibly darker than the rest of the track. If they had someone there reporting back, they might have been able to see that it was raining heavier in that lap. Again, there was a bit of a dip into turn 2 where pretty much everyone kind of went through and crashed, so you could say maybe a bit of water gathered there. It is a hard one, and I kind of feel for the race direction as well, because it's kind of a between a hard place and a rock. They never really get praised, especially on this podcast. But they always seem like they always kind of get flack, and I do give them a fair bit of flack in fairness, but when I do complain about it, I do feel that it's valid and warranted.
It's well deserved.
Yeah, but this week it's just a bad situation because there's so many riders down and bikes on fire, bikes colliding. All it takes is for one of them to get slightly less unlucky and we could have a serious incident. Thankfully, we can report all 10, 11 riders that did crash were okay. Maybe a few bumps, bruises, a bit of strains, but no one with any lasting injuries. So we did get a red flag. It was stopped for about 15 minutes, and then we got a 7-lap shootout with 18 riders left. What did you make of this kind of a parade for the last 7 laps?
It was quite strange because it was just so weird to see so little Moto2 bikes out there. I think that's another issue in itself. Obviously, those riders did crash, but it wasn't really their fault. It was the fault of the conditions. And perhaps they could have waived that 5-minute rule on this occasion, because that's a good chunk of the field. I mean, basically the whole top 10 were gone. So the riders that really deserved to be fighting for the victory were all kind of gone out of the race. So I felt like that was a bit strange. And then also, because it was such a short race, it just felt so weird. It was like a sprint race with half the grid. It was incredible, but it was a decent one. Obviously, I suppose the main thing to mention is that's obviously Jake Dixon started on pole position and ended the lap in the gravel. So yeah, it's cropped up again. We thought maybe we were over this with his first podium, but again under a high pressure situation, and again in tricky conditions, a bit like in Mandalika where there was a little bit of rain, back in Le Mans in 2019, for example, losing the front again. Now, maybe you could argue that was down to the start being quite weird. The person with the flag at the front didn't move. The flag at the back had gone, which is their signal to move, but they didn't seem to move for some reason. Don't know whether there was a communication error there. That obviously allowed the tyres to cool down. However, nobody else crashed by losing the front, so it's not that valid of an excuse. But yeah, sadly, Dixon unfortunately bottling the victory again. But then that allowed Joe Roberts to pick up, didn't it? And Joe Roberts cleared off, absolutely gone. 4 seconds up the road in a 7-lap sprint race is quite incredible, really, isn't it? And wow, what a deserved victory, to be fair. I mean, hats off to him. He managed the conditions, and there was a good battle behind as well, with obviously Navarro and Vietti, Aldeguer, Manu Gonzalez. I was really rooting for him to get a podium. I thought it'd be really nice to see him on the podium, but obviously he didn't manage to do it in the end. But yeah, it wasn't a bad little race, just very strange.
Yeah, it was a bit of a weird one at the start with the flag lady. It looked like, to be honest, that she actually couldn't see past one of the riders, because you saw Mike Webb kind of running onto track and you could kind of see him waving his hands around at her, and it looked like, obviously just in her peripheral vision, if there was a bike or something she just couldn't see it. So it looked like they kind of sat for maybe 10-15 seconds too long, and again it looked pretty cold, cloudy, with already had spots of rain. It was a messy weekend overall in all classes. The rain, everything just seemed to be a bit odd. I'm hoping at Arret now we can have just a plain sailing weekend. We can have a nice sunny Friday, Saturday, Sunday, 3 good races, and we can be sitting here saying, oh, brilliant job from Kinnett and from Rodrigo, and we can talk about all the riders that did well, and we don't have to be kind of going back to these issues, because a lot of these podcasts are taking up with issues that aren't riding or bikes or team issues. They're kind of rules and regulations, race direction, and just silly things that we probably shouldn't be having in this day and age, how big MotoGP really is. But again, can't take anything away from Joe Roberts. I am quite a big fan of Joe Roberts. I remember when he came into the paddock, he seemed pretty good. He looked like he lost his way for a bit, And with the likes of Sean Dillon Kelly and Cambodia come in, he looks like he's kind of maybe fated to be not the number one American in the paddock, but he's got his first win, and I was pretty happy for him. I hope he can push forward and make something of this. Now again, nothing not to take away from him, but it was a strange race, strange conditions, short race. A lot of the riders around him, Jorge Navarro had already crashed this weekend. Vietti knew all his championship rivals out. He was happy to take a P2 or P3. So even though he pulled away, he risked a lot more than a lot of others. He kind of had nothing to lose, whereas the others had a bit more to hold back. So hopefully we can see him put this into practice in a kind of more conventional weekend and get a good result. But that's pretty much it for Moto2. Overall, just messy, it would be the word I'd use for Moto2. But we're going to move on now to the Premier Class, Motogp. Qualifying, we had some weird conditions affecting results. Again, we're going to have to go back to the yellow flag rule, but we're first going to start in Q1. What did you make of, first of all, Remy Gardner, Pecco Bagnaia, Taka Nakagami going out on slicks on a track that clearly wasn't ready?
Yeah, it was a bit of a strange one, but there's been a bit of a precedent set now by the likes of Miller and Marquez have gone out before, where it's been shown that if you can make it work, you can find a few seconds, and obviously in MotoGP it's been so close. If you can find a massive chunk of time, like a second, that's a ridiculous amount, you'll definitely go through into the next session. So for somebody like Remy Gardner, it's worth the risk. And for someone like Bagnaia, who was having an absolutely torrid weekend, yet again, he's really struggling this season. He needed it. He needed to get through. And obviously, the same with Rins, he needed to kind of get through as well. But Remy Gardner had a pretty nasty crash. I think, to be honest, he was going a little bit too full commitment straight away. He sort of really snapped on him and destroyed his bike. So it was a bit, maybe was a bit too early to go on slicks. But I can understand why he probably took that risk, because, I mean, he was never going to get out of that session without that. So it was worth it for him. And obviously, Bagnaia needed to secure that position out there, and he didn't really have the pace either. So I can see why they went for that call, but yeah, it probably was a little bit early. Q2 was a bit more acceptable because obviously it was a lot drier in qualifying too.
Yeah, and there was some very good footage of Pecco's crash from behind, from basically an outside shot of turn one. You just see him, he just crosses a small puddle, a small river of water. You just see the spray kick up, and maybe half a second later the bike just snaps sideways, and he's unfortunately landed pretty hard on his shoulder. He had to go to the hospital for checks. He did get declared fit, of course, but was in quite a bit of pain. Got some injections before the race. There was no lasting injuries for Remy Gardner, but unfortunately Bastianini also crashed on Saturday and hurt his wrist, I believe. So he was walking wounded for Sunday's race. But on to Q2. The track conditions were a little better. They still weren't perfect. There was a dry line starting to form, but it was a very small line at that. Everyone seemed to go out early on slicks, and basically I was sitting there watching it thinking the last man to cross the line is going to be on pole, and it was Zarco who crossed the line with about 11 seconds left, did take pole. But it would have been interesting to see what the grid would have looked if we didn't have all them yellow flags. Marquez ended P8. His lap dot got blacked off for a yellow flag infringement of his teammate. Ironically enough, he would have been P4 ahead of Fabio Quartararo. Now, I expected more from him in the race, but staying with qualifying, if he could have been P4, it might have changed his Sunday. But pole, I kind of was a bit annoyed by Pole's antics. He crashed in the last corner, slid out, of course unhappy, didn't look to be too hurt, kind of lay in the fetal position for a bit longer than he should have, kind of banged the ground, was given out. Marshals came over, had to kind of lift him up to get him off the track, was on the track for a lot longer than he should have. Also in a pretty crazy part of the track to be sitting on the side of the track. And again, I don't like the fact that, again, we go back to the yellow flag rule. What is the perfect way? There is no perfect way. And again, riders kind of acting up in the gravel and in the off the track when they crash do cause extra issues. So Marquez was unfortunately impeded for that. But what did you make of the poleman Zarco's lap at the end of Q2?
Well, I don't think I've actually seen in full his entire lap, but it was really one of those sessions where that last person over the line was going to get pole position, and with all the yellow flag stuff, I suppose that was affecting it as well. It's like you say, Pole was just sat there smack at the ground and really could have got up and walked off. So it was a little bit bad. Obviously, that did affect Marquez, and I think it affected Fabio Quartararo as well, although, you know, as we saw, it didn't really affect him too much. But it was one of those weird sessions. Alex Marquez was looking rapid. once again, as soon as the conditions get weird, Alex Marquez is up there. He just can't seem to do it in the dry, sadly. So it is a shame, but it was nice to see him up there. At least it probably builds him a bit of confidence. Perhaps he'll be a little bit quicker off the back of that. But it was just one of those sessions where it's just all about being the last person over the line. I think Miller could have potentially been one of the last ones over the line, but I think he made a mistake, which basically stopped him from doing that. But Zarco timed it perfectly and back on pole position. Good for Zarco.
Yeah, and another shout out as well for the Aprilia of Espargaro, putting it on the front row alongside kind of a turn time really for Suzuki usually in qualifying, and he managed to put it on P2 as Joan Mir with his teammate down in penultimate position of 23rd. A bit of a weird weekend for Suzuki up until Saturday morning, but good qualifying for Mir. We move on now to the race. Thankfully we had a dry race for MotoGP. It was a bit cloudy and a bit overcast and temperatures slightly dropped, but there wasn't much fear really of rain at the start of the MotoGP race. There was a few question marks whether we'd get all 100% of the race without any rain, and thankfully we did. But we had a good start from mainly Mir. He got a brilliant launch off the line, according to as well Fabio got another brilliant launch. He was up into the top 4 before the end of the first lap, making positions everywhere. So for the first time in a long time we had 2 inline 4s in 1 and 2 on the start of the race. So it was a question of can they put it to good use. So what did you make of the starts of the Yamaha and the Suzuki men?
Well, they were very good, really, because you usually would expect Ducati good starts, but Fabio made it an amazing launch off the line. You think he passed basically both the Ducatis going to the first corner. I think he then lost a place again to Zarco on the brakes, but it was pretty phenomenal. Mir's start was fantastic as well. Obviously, he qualified well. That's the problem with Mir and Suzuki. He can't really qualify, but come to Portimao, fantastic. It really is a bit of an inline 4 track because of how it flows. Is one of those things, though, where if a V4 gets in the way, the inline 4 would struggle. So I think, to be honest, that race was very much set in stone by the events of the qualifying and the practice. If we'd got a normal dry weekend, if we had the likes of Martin and Pecco and Bastianini further up the front with Miller and Zarco, obviously they were already there. So with those 2 riders, and you get in more Ducatis at the front, I think that would have changed the outcome of the race quite substantially, to be honest, because Fabio may have been able to pass one Ducati and then he'd get blasted past the straight by maybe 2 of them and he'd just get stuck. We saw that happen at Portimao the second time last year. So it does... Qualifying matters so much in MotoGP now. If there's a weird session, if you can capitalise on it, you're going to have a good race. We saw that as well. Obviously, Mark Marquez kind of struggled in that race, where if he'd started closer to the front, perhaps he would have done a bit better. Although he did look like he was struggling for grip anyway, so maybe not so much to do with the starting position. So you do see that it really is important qualifying. And those inline 4s, if they can get to the front, they can do the lap times and they can disappear.
Yeah, and we will move on now to the Honda battle. So there was a nice battle just inside the top 10. P6, 7, 8, 9 was kind of all Hondas at one point of the race. It was the 2 Marquez's, Pole, Nakagami was close enough at some points. He unfortunately tagged the back of Brad Binder, lost his wing and crashed out. He did remount to finish the race, but unfortunately was towards the back of the field. But what did you make of mainly the Marquez brothers towards the end of the race? They seem to be going battling quite hard, considering they're on the same bike, and the brothers as well as Paul literally looked just like he was losing a small bit to the Marquez boys. And what did you make of overall the Honda performance in Portugal?
Well, again, it seems like they're not on top of the bike completely. It seemed like they were very good in the wet conditions, because I think it was at FB1 that they did a 1-2. So It definitely seemed like they were there. Obviously, Marquez always goes well in the wet. I think Pole, to be fair, is a fairly decent wet weather rider as well. So perhaps that was masking it slightly. Obviously, Alex Marquez, again, being quite good in the rain. So it is one of those things where, potentially it could have been the riders more than the bike in that situation. But it seemed in the dry conditions, the bike still wasn't quite dialed in. Marquez, or Mark, not looking so comfortable. I keep going to say Marquez, and I realise there's 2 of them. It's a bit confusing there. But the battle between them, first of all, there was a battle between the 2 Repsols, because Alex started further up and sort of dropped back towards them. But at the start of the race, Paul and Mark were very close to each other. And they were putting some hard passes on each other. I mean, obviously, they're fighting really for top dog in that team. Like, while, yes, Mark is kind of always going to have that, if Paul starts outperforming him, it is Honda. They will soon change their alliance to whoever's doing the best on their bike. We've seen that happen in the past, so it really was there was a bit more to it than the position in that race. I think there was some very aggressive passes. Mark did end up winning that battle, and later on, of course, they then caught up to Alex. They were all sort of converging on each other at the end. Mark looked quicker than Alex. I think over the whole lap he was faster, but he just had no grip coming out the last corner. So every time he passed Alex, Alex would then just get the drive out the last corner and blast back past him because he wasn't spinning as much. So it was an interesting little battle of the brothers as well. We haven't really seen Mark and Alex fight at all because usually Mark's sort of close to the front, Alex is a bit close to the back. So yeah, it was a nice little battle, and the Honda showing that it's kind of there, but it's still a fair way off in the dry. It still needs a bit of dialing in.
Yeah, I think they were probably victim most of the lack of dry practice. They really didn't have the bike dialed in as much. We saw in Texas, as the weekend went on, Marcus seemed to get a more of a grip of the Honda. Again, session on session, he built confidence with the bike, and I think all the Hondas, except Alex at the start of the race, were kind of paying price for not having that dry time on track. But we're going to move on now to the championship leader. Unfortunately, Bastianini crashing out in turn 9, just touching a curb. Neil Hodgson said there's a bit of a change of tarmac there as the curb. He said it's easy to crash there. Jake Dixon apparently crashed there in previous years. So a race last year Zarco crashed out of and pretty much ended his championship challenge. I fear what could happen now to Bastianini. I don't believe he'll be out of it as much as Zarco. Zarco kind of caved in after his crash last season out of Portimao, but an unlikely mistake from Bastianini. What did you make of Bastianini's weekend overall as the championship leader?
It wasn't a great weekend for him. It seemed like he struggled in the rain, which we saw at Mandalika as well in the race. He also struggled there, so it seems like perhaps he's not the best in the wet conditions, which is interesting because the Ducati tends to, as over the years, has always tended to be quite a good wet weather bike, but it seems like Bastianini maybe not quite getting on with the rain, and you only need to be off by a little bit in MotoGP now, and you're right at the back of the grid. So he was having a bit of a recovery ride, I suppose, from a poor qualifying. I mean, he crashed in qualifying as well, didn't he? So, even worse. And then, yeah, just an uncharacteristic error, really. Such a small mistake, just to clip that little seam of tarmac near that edge of that curb. But, it's one of those things. I don't think his championship charge is completely over because it's just been such a weird season. Most of the top guys have had DNFs. I mean, if you look at I think top 3 in the championship are Fabio, Rins, and Aleix, and they're there. They've all had one good result at least, but generally they've just been quite consistent. Whereas at least Bastianini's won 2 races, so he should still be pretty close because the amount of points at the top isn't that high. It's a bit like 2020, where actually the amount of points scored by the top rider is quite low compared to previous years. So, one DNF actually this season doesn't seem like it is the end of the world, but it was a setback he really didn't need. Yeah,
and it is interesting to see, is there a bit of a switch now as we get to Europe? Will Fabio start to knock off these victories now, and will this be a weekend we'll look back and go, geez, Bastianini lost it there? If he managed to score a P7, P8 there, could he have maybe slowed down the changeover from championship leader to Fabio? But we're going to move on now to another Suzuki Miller battle. What did you make of that calamity, unfortunately, from Jack Miller?
Yeah, it was a bit of a rookie mistake from Jack Miller, to be honest. Obviously, he'd been looking quite good in the race so far. He'd been biding his time. Mir looked like he was struggling. He was holding up Zarco. Zarco, once Miller started to get there, decided he was going to make the pass, and he made a clean pass on Mir, got past him. And then, yeah, Miller went for it into turn 1. It didn't look like a ridiculous pass, but Mir broke so late. Miller then broke late to match him. What Miller should have done, in reality, once he realised he was going in too fast, was obviously sit the bike up, let the brake off, run wide. We've seen many people do that at Portimao turn 1 over the years. You lose a bit of time, but not too much. But he knew if he wanted to get that second place, he couldn't lose any more time. He needed to get back on the back of Zarco. So he got a bit too greedy, tried to go in with a bit too much entry speed, still tried to make the corner, washed the front out, and poor old Mir just got innocent party completely. It's got absolutely wiped out. Those two got a bit of form, but it did seem like in the gravel, obviously Mir did a bit of a sarcastic clap, but then to his credit, he did go over to Jack, because Jack didn't get up immediately. He did go over to him, see he was okay, and then they seemed to have sort of, been okay in the gravel trap afterwards, sort of just like Miller seemed to apologise. But yeah, it was a bit of a clumsy move from Miller. And I think that's definitely kind of shows that if he is going to lose his factory ride, that's one of the reasons why. Because even when he's doing a good race, he's very likely to throw it away. So yeah, it's I think that's definitely the end of Miller's championship charge as well with that. So yeah, it's a bit.
Yeah, and I reckon he was having a good race because he was sitting in P4 behind Zarco, Fabio, and obviously Rins or Mir. And I was watching thinking he's either labouring early in the race, which is worrying because he'll finish outside the top 10, or he's actually trying to preserve some tyre. And it came to the midpoint of the race and he just started he took 0.4 out of third place, and I said, here we go, we might see something different from Miller. He seemed kind of rattled this weekend, he's riled up a bit. I reckon his contract with the factory team is, I think it's behind the scenes, it's done. He seemed apparently quite pissed off in the Thursday press conference, post or pre-race press conference, so maybe there's something going on there that we won't know yet, but apparently he didn't seem his usual happy self. But he did start to take time out. Of course, Zarco seemed to have a much better exit out of the last corner to be able to make the overtake on the Suzuki man Mir. But when Jack was doing, he seemed to struggle more, and it was more towards the end of the straight that he would kind of gain it, whereas Zarco would already be past the Suzuki. So it looked like he was just on the limit, which he obviously was, and unfortunately a small mistake. It did go down as a race instantly, and it was good to see Miller apologising to the Suzuki camp after he was back in the pits. But from one bad mistake to Suzuki's other rider, Rins, poor Saturday, stunning Sunday. What did you make of Rins' comeback on Sunday?
Well, I want to see that first lap on board with Rins. How did he do that? That was like playing the MotoGP game. The way he made that start. Because he went from 23rd place, was it, to 10th?
Yeah, 13 positions.
Ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. I mean, I imagine that most of that was turn 1, turn 2. I mean, if you place your bike right, you get a good launch, you can pass a fair few riders, but it's GP. These guys are not mugs. This is not the early 2000s where, Rossi gets put to the back of the grid or something for that Qatar. If you go back to that Qatar race for doing the burnout on the grid, the Yamaha, the factory Yamaha's like 2 seconds quicker than some of the slower bikes, and he's made a great start and he's up into the top 10. This is 2022 MotoGP where everyone's separated by less than a second, and Rins has gone from the back of the field to the top 10 in one lap. I really want to see that lap. What a stunning lap. And then after that, in the past, Rins would have crashed. Rins would have crashed out of this race 100%, trying to chase down, try and get to that podium early on, but he bided his time. The crash happened in front of him. He gained a few positions. Just really impressed with him. He didn't over push for the podium, and in the past he definitely would have done that. So Rins really is looking like a new man this year, and he had some adversity and he overcame it in a mature, and that is a world champion's ride, and you've not ever been able to say that about Rins before.
Yeah, he's a different man this year. He's the way he's managed to ride at 99%, and again I think the upgrades to Suzuki has allowed him. I think he said before that last year everyone else had made a step, Suzuki kind of plateaued and he had to ride extra 1 or 2%, and that's what was causing all them crashes, just to be there, whereas last year Mir was nowhere but he was seeing the flag. So it looks like Suzuki bringing a better bike, along with him taking a step back, looking at himself going, right, I crashed my brains out last year, I need to see the flag, as well as having a much better package has allowed just a bit of a revitalisation of his career in MotoGP, because a lot of people at the start this year were like, he's gone, if they keep Mir they'll get another rider in, another young rider in, and start the process over again. But it looks like no, he's probably more secure than Mir in that team, because Mir seems to be a little less happy about the Suzuki than Rins. So brilliant though, I'm happy for Alex Rins, I do like him, and after his 2020 season where Marquez's injury, he was one of the riders you would expect to step up and be there. He was obviously more experienced than his teammate who went on to win the title, injuring his collarbone in Jerez. So he's had a couple of bad years, and it's good now that he's put 5 races together, and I look forward to seeing what he can do now in Europe when we get into the proper, the Le Mans, the Jerez, the Mugellos, to see what he can do there. But we have to cover off the MotoGP race, just talking about Fabio. We've talked a lot about Yamaha so far this season, on how they've just been lost looking for extra pace. They've been unable to battle in the races. We talked about how he got a good start He dominated the race, really. He got ahead of Mir early. He went earlier than I kind of was expecting. I thought that he would be kind of happy to sit there on Mir and go when the time was right, but he literally looked like he wanted to make a point and went early and put in a good few mid-39s, kind of proper race pace of a track that was in good condition, never mind the track that had been rained off for the last couple of days. So overall, I was really impressed, and again, it just shows he is the real deal. He is a world champion right there now, to be able to put it all on the line at the first opportunity of a good race weekend, and he wins by 5-6 seconds. What did you make of Quartararo's dominance?
It was fantastic. It really was. I mean, just one of those races where he put it together perfectly. And it was quite funny after the race. BT were talking to Lynn Jarvis, and he said when he saw Fabio go past Mir on the straight, he was like, I saw that scream properly there, because obviously he blasted past him. But he got such a good run out of that last corner. He had temps over everybody in that last sector, which is virtually really like sort of the last corner where you gain a lot of that time. And the run he got out of that corner, that's what was helping him. He just went past Mir like he was standing still and completely disappeared into the distance. He just looked phenomenal. He was absolutely flawless. And compared to the other Yamahas, I think, what was he, about 30 seconds in front of Morbidelli, something like that?
33 over the line.
Yeah, it was absolutely ridiculous. He was miles in front of Morbidelli, wasn't he? So, and obviously Dovizioso as well. So, yeah, fantastic from Quartararo. That's why he's the reigning world champion. And without him, Yamaha would be in a mess, because nobody else has the confidence in the front end to run it through the corners like Fabio does. They're trying to ride it more like Valentino, I think, with the sort of stop into the corner and fire out, sort of more rider style late on the brakes. And I just don't think you can do that anymore with the Yamaha.
Yeah, it just shows that he's been getting 110% out of that bike this year. Obviously, he had a great result in Indonesia in the rain. Qatar was as best. He got out-dragged by the Ducati of Zarco in Qatar to the line, lost P8 I think it was at the time. Didn't have a great Argentina race, says he doesn't get onto that track. Looked pretty racy in Texas. Again, looked like he got the most out of what he could have. And again, he said, he also was interviewed on BT Sport and said he had basically time in hand. After he got past Mir, built a few seconds, realised he wasn't being caught and that the gap was going up, that he said he could just kind of reel it in a bit, make sure of it. And it'll be interesting. The next few races now is going to be very interesting. We have Jerez next year, where he's won twice. He won twice in 2020. He won both races there. Didn't win there last year, had the arm pump, came right back after being way out in front, but he does have good form there. Took his first pole position there in 2019, so it'll be interesting to see, will he wipe the floor with them there, or will there be a bit of a change of guard there? He's been the fastest man by far there over the last couple of years, so I'll be expecting him to be really strong there. And if he puts two races in a row together, then goes to his home race, then we go to Mugello, a track that is brilliant for Yamaha, even though it has that massive home straight, just left, right, long corners, high corner speed. I wouldn't be surprised if we go from here now through to Assen Sachsenring time, when Quartararo is the man for the championship, and we were talking about who can beat Quartararo going forward. So that is it for today. Is there any final thoughts about Jerez, really, Rhys, just as we move on to next week's race?
Pretty much just agree with you, to be honest. Obviously, going into these races, these are the Yamaha, these are the Fabio Quartararo tracks: Jerez, Le Mans, Mugello, Catalunya, Assen, all these circuits. He could end up winning a good 5 races in a row, to be honest, because he should have won Jerez last year. Obviously Le Mans rained. If that didn't rain, he would have won there too. So he dominated Mugello. Obviously Pecco did crash, but I think he probably would have beaten him there anyway, to be honest. And then obviously Catalunya had the issue with the suit, could well have won there as well. So yeah, this could be the streak here. Obviously the Yamaha is built for these kind of tracks. These are the tracks the Yamaha is designed for. So if Fabio can win the races here, then yeah, right, you might have some tough weekends elsewhere, but at this point of the season, even though he struggled a lot, the other riders that should be there, the ones he's actually fighting, really, if you look at it, aren't there. Like, where are some of the Ducati riders? So yeah, I think this could be the start of Quartararo starting to pull out a bit of a lead in this championship.
Yeah, and on that note, we're going to end it off. So thank you all for tuning in today. If you are watching on YouTube, feel free to drop a like down below and consider subscribing. If you are listening in on Spotify, feel free to give us a 5-star review if you have enjoyed today's podcast. We will be back next week with Jerez round 6 of the Motogp 22 Championship. So thank you all for tuning in. We shall catch you in the next one. Bye bye. Take care.